Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I hope everyone can hear me. My name's Joe Beatty. I'm Director of Electronic Outreach at the Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. And I'm glad to welcome you all this evening to this webinar. Just as a brief introduction, Classical American Homes Preservation Trust was founded by Richard H. Jenrette in 1993 with a mission to preserve, protect, and open to the public examples of classical American residential architecture and their surrounding landscapes and scenic trails, as well as fine and decorative arts of the first half of the 19th century. CAHPT maintains 4 sites in 3 states, 3 of which are currently open to the public. It seeks to inspire learners of all ages and to educate the next generation of preservation professionals and craftspeople through hands-on research, applied preservation, and inspiring interpretation. I'd like now to introduce our presenter this evening, Grant Quertermous, who is our Curator and Director of Collections. And just as a note of protocol, so we're going to save the questions till the end. Please feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat box, and I'll filter through them. And as time allows, Grant will address those questions at the end. So Grant, it's off to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm going to get some things set up here and share my screen, get in presentation mode, and actually turn my camera off, but I promise I am still here. So again, welcome everyone. I'm so glad you all are able to join us tonight. It's always a pleasure to be able to discuss our collection. And tonight, I'm going to present an in-depth look at our collection at Edgewater up in the Hudson River Valley. I'm also going to look at our founder, Dick Jenrette's evolution as a collector, most notably his conversion to Americana, as he termed it in the early 1970s, that was directly responsible for building the collection. His decision to focus his efforts on collecting American decorative arts was the result of weekends that he and his partner, Bill Thompson, spent antiquing in the region around Edgewater, and the influence of antique dealer Fred Johnson, whose shop was located in Kingston across the river. It was Johnston who commented that Jenrette owned 2 of the greatest 19th century American houses and that he should fill them with American furniture of the same period rather than the 18th century British and European antiques that he was collecting at that time. Jenrette heeded Johnston's advice and began assembling a collection of classical New York furniture made between 1800 and 1840. He considered this furniture to be the finest made in America at that time. It represented, as he wrote, an amalgam of English, French, and other European taste, unlike earlier 18th century American furniture, which he felt was largely copied from British examples. The significant collections at all of our properties are the results of Jenrette's nearly 50-year pursuit of American decorative arts, including his efforts to assemble the largest collection of furniture by cabinet maker Duncan Phyfe, and that includes original pieces that he returned both to Edgewater, such as this pair of card tables, and Milford, our site in South Carolina. As with any collector, Jenrette developed an expertise in that subject, allowing him to occasionally find a piece like the sofa from the Donaldson Suite, which wasn't even given a Phyfe attribution by the prominent New York auction house selling it in 1980. As he developed a reputation for collecting New York furniture, he later wrote he no longer had to browse, the market came to him. And while he collected what can only be described as museum quality examples of classical New York furniture, he also believed the pieces should be used rather than stanchioned off behind a barrier. He invited guests, whether they were a British peer or a group of graduate students, to sit in a Phyfe chair or sofa, even if it was owned by a historical figure such as DeWitt Clinton or Eliza Jumel Burr. Those attending a dinner party would be seated in Duncan Phyfe chairs around a Duncan Phyfe dining table frequently as well. Now, no discussion of Dick Jenrette as a collector can be complete without mentioning the Empire Mafia, a group of like-minded collectors who served as mentors, but also competitors in his quest to acquire the best of this period. The dons of this mafia were a who's who of the Americana world in the 1970s. Barry Tracy was curator of the Met's American Wing and was part of the team who presented the museum's 1970 Centennial exhibition, 19th Century America, and oversaw the renovation of the American Wing period rooms. Before his arrival at the Met, he curated the acclaimed 1963 Newark Museum exhibition, Classical America. But he's probably best remembered for the furnishing project at Boscobel and the resulting book about that collection. Next, Georgia architect and collector Edward Vason Jones. In Washington, Jones collaborated with Clement Conger, who succeeded in transforming 2 floors of a drab mid-century government office building into the diplomatic reception rooms, providing a venue for the Secretary of State to receive foreign dignitaries surrounded by the best examples of American decorative arts. Jones also assisted in the redecoration of the public rooms of the White House during several administrations. Here he is with First Lady Pat Nixon, daughter Tricia Nixon, and daughter Julie Nixon, and Clement Conger, and David Richmond Byers, another decorator who worked on some of Dick's houses as well. Ed Jones died, as I'll discuss momentarily, Jones and his team of skilled craftsmen undertook the redecoration of Edgewater, as well as a federal townhouse that Dick owned at the time on Charlton Street in New York, seen here. Jones died in 1980, and Dick acquired several pieces that were formerly in his collection, that are now in the Classical American Homes collection. Rounding out the group was Dick Button, the Olympic, world, and national champion figure skater and later sports commentator, the last surviving member. Jenrette recalled once flipping a coin with Dick Button to determine who would bid on a mirror they both wanted at Sotheby's. After Dick Jenrette began to exclusively collect American decorative arts, Edgewater was completely redecorated under the guidance of Edward Vason Jones. The bright yellow walls that you see here in this 1969 photo were painted slate gray and later white, and the European and British antiques were removed. On the western wall of the drawing room, a stunning pair of gilded Albany, New York-made girandoles was hung over 2 pier tables with ornate stencil decoration attributed to La Nuée. Another early acquisition placed prominently in the drawing room was Charles Peale Polk's portrait of Washington at the Battle of Princeton. In 1972, designer Harrison Cultra alerted Dick to an article about artist George Cook in magazine Antiques that featured his portrait of Susan Gaston Donaldson in the Brooklyn Museum collection. Upon visiting the Brooklyn Museum to see the portrait, Jenrette learned that the museum had additional pieces of Donaldson furniture in their collection. Robert Donaldson commissioned a suite of furniture from Duncan Phyfe while living in North Carolina in 1822, with subsequent commissions after his move to New York. The Donaldsons used the furniture in New York City, then at their home Blythewood, and finally Edgewater after purchasing that property in 1852. The suite is well documented on Donaldson's estate inventory, and later in 1912 at the home of his daughter in New Jersey. Jenrette hoped to persuade the Brooklyn Museum to deaccession and sell the pieces, but in the end, the parties agreed to a long-term loan, and the objects came to Edgewater in 1973 and remained on long-term loan. And these are, of course, the objects that Classical American Homes was able to recently acquire, realizing Mr. Jenrette's wish to make them part of our permanent collection. Now, one of the reasons that I love this portrait of Susan Gaston Donaldson so much is because of the objects depicted in it. Susan sat for Cook in the fall of 1832 in the parlor of the Donaldson house at 15 State Street. You can see Battery Park and Castle Clinton out the open window behind her. One of the 5 window seats is just visible, as is Susan's pedal harp by London maker Alexander Berry. Susan was known to be a skilled musician who was equally adept at playing the piano and harp, as well as vocal performance. Fredrika Bremer, a Swedish author visiting the Donaldsons in 1849, was treated to a performance and wrote about it in her diary that was later published. Now, I can't discuss this harp without recounting the story of how Dick acquired it. It remained in the Donaldson family until the 1920s, when it was purchased by the noted collector Margaret Haskell. Mrs. Haskell or her daughter later donated the harp to the Colonial Dames of America for display at their Manhattan Museum. Around the same time that Dick began discussing the harp with the dames, a nearly identical harp came up for sale at Sotheby's. They worked out a deal where Dick acquired the harp at Sotheby's for the dames, which you see here in the museum, and traded it for Susan's original, allowing him to return that harp to Edgewater to display beneath Susan's portrait. Now, I could give an entire lecture on the furniture that Donaldson commissioned from Duncan Phyfe between 1822 and 1830. It's a fascinating suite. Here's a number of extant pieces in other museum collections, the center table at Winterthur, and this great secretary desk in a private collection. But it's the best documented group of Phyfe's ornamented Grecian style. The seating furniture utilizes multiple decorative techniques, including stenciled and freehand gilding, applied ornaments of die-stamped brass, and vert antique, a synthetic patina that was applied to resemble oxidized brass. One notable characteristic is the gilded melon-shaped feet. Upholstered in red silk damask, echoing the original, it's stunning furniture. And imagine how the gilt accents would have appeared when illuminated by candle or gaslight in the 19th century. Through the assistance of a mutual friend in the 1970s, Jenrette was introduced to Mary Cromwell Allison, Robert Donaldson's great-granddaughter and only living descendant. At that time, Mrs. Allison was living on the Mediterranean coast in Spain, and Jenrette had an opportunity to visit her and see her collection, which included original family portraits, like this portrait of Robert Donaldson at far left, and furniture, silver, glass, all manner of original objects. She also owned additional pieces of Phyfe furniture, including the Canterbury used by Susan Donaldson to store her sheet music, which, as you can see in the image on the left, Mrs. Allison used to store her record collection. And then at right, this is the catalog image of the Canterbury from the 2011 Met exhibition on Duncan Phyfe. Mrs. Allison had no children of her own, and she was so thrilled by Mr. Jenrette's efforts to restore Edgewater that she promised to bequeath the objects to him. She passed away in 1976, and Jenrette received the promised objects, allowing Robert Donaldson's portrait to return to Edgewater. Another important object he received was this lady's writing table, also commissioned from Phyfe in 1828, with those same melon-shaped feet. Used by Susan Donaldson, it also bears the name Lizzie Donaldson on the underside of one till, indicating its use by daughter Lizzie after Susan's death in 1866. As Dick became known as a collector and preservationist, his houses and collection were regularly featured in periodicals, ranging from antiques to Town and Country to Forbes. One 1981 article led to the reunion of a pair of Gilbert Stuart portraits that had been separated for more than 80 years. In 1980, Dick purchased this 1804 portrait of Major General John Peter Van Ness from a direct descendant of the sitter. A native of Columbia County, Van Ness attended Columbia College and read law. He was a protege of Aaron Burr and won election to Congress in 1801. Once in Washington, President Jefferson appointed him major of the district militia, and he later served as mayor of DC in the 1830s. The portrait was photographed for the magazine article in Edgewater's morning room, and as luck would have it, the article was read by another Van Ness descendant living in Baltimore, who reached out to Dick to let him know that she owned the companion portrait of the sitter's wife, Marcia Burns Van Ness. A short time later, he acquired that portrait and was able to reunite the couple for the first time in more than 80 years. And here they are today, hanging in Edgewater's dining room. Now, the Van Ness portraits date to a period in Gilbert Stuart's career when he was painting in Washington, and his commissions often included paired portraits of husbands and wives. Others from the same time period include the portraits of Dr. William Thornton and his wife, Anna Maria, in the National Gallery of Art collection, as well as then Secretary of State James Madison and his wife, Dolly. There are notable similarities of the group. Clearly, Stuart found a successful formula and ran with it. The Van Nesses, who married in 1802, are a fascinating couple who I've actually encountered several times previously in my career. First, when I was a curator at Montpelier doing research on the Madisons, and then more recently at Tudor Place, the Georgetown home of descendants of Martha Washington, as the Peter family there were also friends with the Van Nesses as well. She was the only daughter and heir of David Burns, her father, whose farm was purchased by the federal government to become the new federal city. You can see the portion outlined here was an overlay of Burns Farm on top of present-day Washington, D.C. So you can see how much of D.C. was actually owned by Burns. Van Ness described his future wife in a letter, saying her, quote, reputation, merit, and prospects are all unimpeachable. She has a well-improved mind and possesses personal accomplishments. When the Van Nesses set for Gilbert Stuart in 1805, they lived just a few blocks from the artist's Washington studio. Now, what's interesting about the portraits is Stuart scholars have commented that the background of both paintings appears to have been rendered rather quickly, especially when compared to some of the other paired portraits in that group. So, for example, compare Marcia Burns' Van Ness, the background on the left, to Dolly Madison's here on the right, and you can see the differences in how the background was rendered. An invoice Stuart sent to Van Ness in July of 1805 suggests that these were some of the last portraits he painted before leaving Washington that summer. That may account for the rather quickly rendered background. Mrs. Van Ness used her wealth to become a notable philanthropist, and along with her friend Dolly Madison, founded a charity to benefit orphan children of Washington, D.C. that's still in existence today. They commissioned a house from architect of the Capitol, Benjamin Henry Latrobe, seen here, that was located on what was previously located off Constitution Avenue. Their only daughter, Anne, married Arthur Middleton, son of the governor of South Carolina, and she tragically died from complications in childbirth, along with her infant. Following their deaths, Van Ness commissioned architect George Hatfield to design a classical mausoleum for their property, later moved to Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown in the 1870s. In addition to the Van Ness portraits, at Edgewater we have another pair of later Stuart portraits from 1823 depicting Moses and Elizabeth Porter Wheeler of Boston. The Wheeler portraits show how Stuart's approach to portraiture changed in the 18 years since he painted the Van Ness set in Washington. Stuart moved to Boston in 1805 and painted there for the rest of his life. Like many portraits from the Boston period, the Wheeler portraits are oil on panel rather than canvas. Stuart preferred panels of either yellow pine from North Carolina or Caribbean mahogany, which was texturized by dragging a dogtooth plane iron diagonally over the wood to give it a texture very much like a twill weave canvas. Moses Wheeler was a successful Boston merchant, and the family resided at 132 Tremont Street, overlooking Boston Common. Less than 2 years after setting for their portraits, Elizabeth tragically died from typhus in 1825. Gilbert Stuart himself died in 1828, very deeply in debt. An exhibition of his portraits was held at the Boston Athenaeum to benefit his widow and children, and the Wheeler portraits were included. You can see them as number 25 and 26, and interestingly, they were hanging just before portraits of the former 5 presidents of the United States, commissioned by Bostonian John Doggett. That's a series of portraits that scholars of Gilbert Stuart have studied very frequently. Now, another artist represented in our collection at Edgewater is Ezra Ames, who was active in the upper Hudson River Valley for nearly 40 years. Ames is best known for his portraits of then Governor George Clinton. This one from our collection depicts Clinton while he was vice president of the United States. Clinton served as vice president for Jefferson's second term, replacing Burr, and then he served 4 years in Madison's administration, before dying in office in 1812. The bridge spanning the Hudson that's visible from Edgewater is named in Clinton's honor, and his grave is located just across the river in a Kingston churchyard. This Ames portrait hanging in the morning room at Edgewater is of a youthful Edward Everett, and it's actually a period copy of Gilbert Stuart's circa 1820 life portrait, now in Harvard's collection. Everett was a career politician and president of Harvard, but he's best remembered as the orator who delivered a 2-hour speech at the dedication of Gettysburg's National Cemetery, preceding Abraham Lincoln's more memorable 2-minute address. And I can't discuss portraiture in the collection without highlighting this portrait of Daniel Tompkins, another vice president of the United States, as well as former governor of New York. This 1819 portrait by Charles Wilson Peale was completed for display in the Long Gallery of Peale's Philadelphia Museum, which contained over 200 portraits of public figures and military heroes displayed adjacent to dioramas featuring taxidermized birds and mammals and other natural specimens. While I'm discussing artwork, I wanted to share some interesting research about a painting that formerly hung at Edgewater, so one that's presently unlocated, but one that I would really love to find, and I'm pretty sure it's still out there somewhere, so I'm hoping someday that it will turn up. In 1829, Robert Donaldson commissioned this painting from artist Samuel F.B. Morse, better known for his role as an inventor of the telegraph. Morse was in Rome, and Donaldson commissioned him to paint a copy of the School of Athens, Raphael's 1511 fresco in the Vatican's Apostolic Palace, depicting a gathering of ancient Greek philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians. Morse received $300 for the commission and delivered the painting to Donaldson in 1831. He notes in the back of the canvas that he was engaged 3 months in copying it, and talks about the challenges in a series of letters because of the state of the fresco at the time. It was 300 plus years old at the time that Morse was attempting to copy, and he talks about the colors being bad. There were some cracks in it and that sort of thing. So it was quite a challenging project. At Edgewater, the painting hung in the Octagon Library, and it was recorded there at the time of Robert Donaldson's death here on his estate inventory. After descending in Donaldson's family, it was loaned to the Metropolitan Museum of Art by a family member in 1922 and thankfully photographed at that time. I discovered this image in the collection of the Frick Art Reference Library. In addition to Donaldson objects, another strength of the collection at Edgewater are objects with Livingston family provenance, which is a nod to Edgewater's earliest owners, Margaretta Livingston Brown and her husband Lowndes. The Browns received the Edgewater property as a wedding gift from her father, John Livingston, and it was originally part of his estate, Messina, one of an unbroken line of Livingston properties that stretched along the eastern shore of the Hudson River for more than 10 miles. Jenrette was able to acquire furniture, objects, and even portraits with Livingston family provenance associated with many of these Livingston properties. Although I have to say my favorite one is Wrongside, the very cleverly named Livingston property of Victor Livingston that was located on the west side of the river. So a good creative name there that I'll talk about again in just a minute. This Sheffield plate tea urn in the entrance hall at Edgewater features the initials LB for Lowndes Brown. It was used by Mr. and Mrs. Brown at Edgewater and then given to her cousin Victor Livingston in the 1850s after she sold Edgewater and moved to England. The portrait displayed above it in the entrance hall by John Vanderlyn depicts Mrs. Brown's cousin, Julia Livingston, as a young girl running through the gardens of Messina. Julia was the daughter of diplomat Edward Livingston and the first cousin of Margaretta Brown, though they were more like sisters, as Julia spent much of her young life at Messina. Her mother died in 1801, and her father was in New Orleans for much of the time, so she was left in the care of her uncle and aunt. She actually died at Messina in 1813. At only 19 years of age. In the dining room at Edgewater, both the sideboard and the suite of 5 dining chairs have Livingston family provenance. Each of the 12 dining room chairs features skillfully carved hairy paw feet and were considered by Jenrette to be some of the finest fife ever made. I mean, just look at the carving on the knees of these chairs. They're just amazing. And again, these are details that you don't even see if you were sitting in the chairs. They descended in the family of architect Goodhue Livingston, and Jenrette acquired them from the widow of Edward Vason Jones. Interestingly, both Jenrette and Jones had previously seen the suite of chairs at a Manhattan antique shop, but Jones purchased them first before Jenrette had the opportunity. Finally, the set of French porcelain, including a tureen, vases, and several serving bowls, candlesticks, and reticulated baskets, all featuring a gilt L. Each navette or round-shaped basket, known as a corbeille, was supported by kneeling wing caryatids of biscuit porcelain on an oval base with gilt paw feet. These baskets were typically used in the period as both table decoration and service pieces and could be filled with either flowers or fruit. Jenrette acquired the service at a 1974 estate auction at Callender House in Tivoli, originally the residence of Henry Livingston. A mid-19th century owner of Callender House, Johnston Livingston, had apparently attended an 1857 auction at New Claremont and purchased the majority of Chancellor Robert Livingston's belongings for his own collection. This portrait in the Octagon Library at Edgewater depicts John Phillips Montgomery as a child. In 1823, his father, also named John Montgomery of Philadelphia, purchased an estate south of Tivoli that he named Eglinton, the likely setting for this portrait. Painted by Jacob Eicholtz, the nearly life-size portrait descended in the Montgomery family. In 1978, Jenrette acquired it from Margaret Lynch Suckley, great niece of the sitter. Better known as Daisy, Miss Suckley owned Wilderstein in Rhinecliff and was for many years the confidant of her distant cousin, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and first archivist at his presidential library. She's, of course, the person who also gave him Fala, his terrier, seen in the image at right. Clearly, the greatest strength of the Edgewater collection is the classical New York furniture by Fife and his contemporary cabinet makers. This stunning Fife sofa in the drawing room features rare double Grecian cross fronts or cerule legs terminating in cast brass paw feet. Made between 1805 and 1815, it's evidence of Fife's mastery of this form. The rolled arms and back are divided into tablets which feature carved cornucopias and foliage. While this example is upholstered, it shares numerous similarities with two other sofas with caned bottoms, one at top in the American Wing collection at the Met, and the one at bottom in the Carolette collection at the MFA Boston. Jenrette acquired the sofa from Manhattan dealers Bernard and Dean Levy in 1974, so another fairly early purchase of his collection. The library table seen here by Fife has a historic association with the DePeyster family, another old New York family. It features 4 skillfully carved colonnettes surrounded by a central pineapple. It was a 1972 purchase from Fred Johnston, the Kingston dealer, who I've previously discussed tonight. Lanoue was probably Fife's greatest competition in New York City, and the one cabinet maker who at times surpasses him in some aspects of carving and production of various furniture forms. Born in France, he immigrated to the US in 1803, and from 1804 until his death in 1819, operated a shop at 60 Broad Street. I've already mentioned the Lanoue pier tables in the drawing room, and also want to note this other one in the collection as well. And finally, this wardrobe or French press by Lanoue in Jenrette's dressing room on the 2nd floor of Edgewater with its figured mahogany panels outlined in brass trim. With an interior featuring linen slides and drawers, it closely resembles other documented examples by the cabinet maker. Now, Duncan Fife's shop was active for 55 years, and it closed in 1847. This is, of course, the very well-known auction that took place to distribute the remaining inventory at the closure of the shop. And the Edgewater collection features several examples of work by later 19th century New York cabinet makers who were directly influenced by Fife's style. For example, 2 German immigrant cabinet makers, Ernest Hagen and Matthew Meyer, made a name for themselves repairing Fife pieces and accepting commissions to make additional matching chairs for a client's suite of Fife furniture. In some cases, to anyone except the best trained connoisseurs and collectors, their work is almost impossible to discern from earlier Fife pieces. Now, thankfully, most of their pieces were either stamped or labeled, but there are a couple of known instances where they added additional carving to Fife pieces, so sort of making a pastiche of original and later added carving as well on a piece of furniture. The Hagen and Meyer chairs in our collection speak to their role of supplementing suites of Fife chairs. In the early 19th century, Dr. Oliver Bronson, who was Robert Donaldson's brother-in-law actually, commissioned a suite of chairs from Duncan Fife. The cerule base armchairs descended in his family and were likely divided among his heirs after his death. In 1880, his grandson Frederick Bronson commissioned additional matching chairs from Hagen and Meyer, those in our collection, to supplement the suite. We're fortunate to have 4 chairs from this set, as well as other examples of Hagen and Meyer's work in our collection. Moving away from furniture, our collection includes numerous prints, pastel and charcoal portraits, sketches, and even historical maps. Time allows me to highlight just a few this evening. In the morning room are several studies by artist John Vanderlyn for his monumental landing of Columbus, completed in 1846 for the rotunda of the US Capitol. Another work associated with van der Linde is the 1804 aqua tent of his distant view of Niagara Falls. In 1801, van der Linde was the first professional artist to visit the falls, spending 12 days making sketches from which he produced 2 oil paintings. While in London, he engaged engravers Lewis and Marigot to reproduce the works, hoping to sell subscriptions for the resulting prints. Among his subscribers was President Thomas Jefferson, who paid $20 for the pair of engravings. Another set of regional interest is the Hudson River Portfolio, a series of 20 hand-colored engravings depicting scenes along the Hudson River from its source in the Adirondacks south to New York Harbor. We have 2 full sets of this series in the Classical American Homes collection, and one is displayed throughout the house at Edgewater. The engravings are based on watercolor paintings by William Guy Wall, one of the first artists to paint the Hudson River landscape several decades before the emergence of the Hudson River School of Art. John Hill made engravings of Wall's paintings that were published by Henry McGarry between 1821 and 1825. Jenrette began collecting the first set in 1972, and he later discovered evidence that Donaldson owned a set and displayed them at Edgewater in the mid-19th century. Among the sculpture in the collection is this bust of Supreme Court Justice John Jay, attributed to John Frazee, an object that has remained in the house since the early 20th century. In 1902, Edgewater was purchased from Donaldson's heirs by John J. Chapman and his second wife, Elizabeth Astor Chandler Chapman. Elizabeth, seen here in her portrait by John Singer Sargent, was one of the Astor orphans of nearby Rokeby, a property adjacent to Edgewater, and Chapman was a direct descendant of Chief Justice Jay. The Chapmans only lived at Edgewater for a short time, as they commissioned Charles Platt to design another house on the property overlooking the river, which they called Sylvania. Chapman was an essayist and critic, and who used Edgewater as a writing retreat, especially the Octagon Library, and in 1910 his mother moved into the house for a period of several years. The bust of Chief Justice Jay is an artifact of their ownership and was in the house when Gore Vidal purchased Edgewater in 1950 and conveyed with the house when Mr. Jenrette purchased it in 1969. Just across from the room is a Udon bust of inventor Robert Fulton, a bronze, placed so he gazes out toward the Hudson River, where he navigated his steamboat Claremont in 1807. Edgewater also has numerous mantel clocks, including these stunning French examples, including this one made for the American market commemorating George Washington. Now, I wanted to wrap up tonight by sharing a recent research project focused on the tall case clock in the entrance hall, an object that Mr. Jenrette received from Mrs. Allison's bequest in 1976. She believed that the clock belonged to Robert Donaldson's father and was among the objects brought to North Carolina when he immigrated from Scotland in the late 18th century. The face bears the signature of clockmaker John Jones, who was active in the Welsh city of Wrexham in the late 18th century. The mahogany case with fruitwood inlay is a likely replacement since it dates a little later than the face and works, and the brass and metal face feature painted numerals, a calendar aperture, and a moon phase. Of course, clocks can be prized family heirlooms, so the lore about this clock isn't totally outrageous, but there's just one problem. There's no evidence for a tall case clock in any surviving inventory associated with Edgewater or the North Carolina house of Donaldson's parents. Robert and Sarah Donaldson died within 4 months of each other in 1808, leaving their 5 children as orphans who were raised by relatives. A complete inventory was taken of their Fayetteville, North Carolina household in the fall of 1808, as everything was sold and proceeds kept in trust to provide for the children. However, no clock is on that inventory. And of course, tall case clocks were typically higher value objects, so there is no logical reason why it would be omitted from this inventory. The final strike, yes, that pun was intended, is that Isabel Donaldson Bronson, Donaldson's daughter, never mentions the clock in any of her written recollections of the family heirlooms that she inherited. This is a reminiscences that she provided. It's now in our archives. And for example, the page on the left, she describes some history of the George Cook portrait of Susan that I was discussing earlier as well. She was the last surviving Donaldson child, so she inherited all of the family heirlooms. So what does this suggest about the clock? I think it's actually a Bronson family piece rather than associated with the Donaldsons. And here's why I'm thinking this. Robert Donaldson's youngest sister, Joanna, married Oliver Bronson, who I discussed earlier, commissioning the chairs. The couple eventually had 4 sons. Their youngest, Robert, married his first cousin, Isabel Donaldson of Edgewater. They were married at Edgewater and lived in the house for 8 years. After near financial ruin from bad real estate speculations, Robert Bronson took a job as a clerk in New York City and moved his family to Summit, New Jersey. The clock can be documented in a turn-of-the-century photo of that house, and it subsequently appears in a 1912 inventory of that same house taken after his death. So I started looking at the Bronson family, working backwards from the known Robert Bronson to his father, Dr. Oliver Bronson, and then back another generation to Isaac Bronson IV, who died in Connecticut in 1838. Sure enough, among the contents of Isaac Bronson IV's Greenfield, Connecticut house was, quote, 1 clock and case. Bronson's widow, Anna, whose portrait hangs at Edgewater up on the 2nd floor, inherited the bulk of his estate. Following her 1850 death, the contents of the house were divided among her children, a logical time for Oliver to receive this clock, and later descended to his son, Robert. While this still needs a bit of research, I think both the positive and the negative evidence is clearly suggesting that this is likely a Bronson family object. It's easy to see how identities of Donaldson and Bronson objects would get intermingled, as they were together for more than 40 years in a household of 2 individuals with very close ties to both families. And I should point out, in this same image of the clock, you can see, if you look back through the door, the George Cook portrait of Susan Gaston Donaldson hanging on the wall, and that's actually the Donaldson's center table by Fife, now in the Winterthur collection there under the portrait as well. Having spent much of my career focused on provenance research, I can tell you that details about the history of objects easily get conflated, especially when you get 2 or 3 generations removed from an original owner of an object. So if this isn't a Donaldson clock, how does that impact its display at Edgewater? I can tell you that it doesn't. It was one of the pieces that Mr. Jenrette displayed in the house for almost 50 years, linking it to Edgewater during his ownership, and likely during the Bronsons' residence earlier as well, like many of the other objects I've discussed this evening. Tonight, we've examined the highlights of Edgewater's collection, the results of 50 years of collecting by Mr. Jenrette, as well as our foundation's efforts to continue to build the collection, such as that recent acquisition of Donaldson objects from the Brooklyn Museum. For Dick Jenrette, Edgewater was home for half a century, a house where he and Bill lived, surrounded by the collection that they built together. And part of what makes this collection so important is its setting. Many of the objects that I've highlighted were previously in the house during the mid-19th century. And today, when visitors come to Edgewater, they can experience this collection in a domestic setting, the context in which these objects and others in the collection were historically used or displayed. Today, we can use the objects at Edgewater and to tell the stories of the past and interpret all those who lived and labored on the property. We also use this remarkable collection as a teaching tool to help train the next generation of museum professionals like our Thompson Fellowship participants. I want to invite you to further explore our online catalog if you want to look at some more information about some of these objects that I've discussed or others in the collection, or better yet, visit Edgewater to see this amazing house and collection for yourself. Thank you very much. I'm now going to stop my screen sharing here and turn my video back on. So I'm happy to answer some questions now. I'm going to get a sip of water here.
Grant, I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but I put I pasted a link to the collections page in
Oh,
the
awesome. Thank you.
chat for anyone who's interested. And while you're on the website, also check our events page, which may have been how you found out about this particular webinar. We publicize all the things that we have going on, and we've got lots of stuff coming up.
I have to start singing and tap dancing if we don't get any questions. So.
I think you covered things in great detail. Maybe that's what. Are there any questions that you wish people would ask?
Yeah, I do get the question before. I've gotten the question before, you know, are there any pieces that have been reattributed or anything in the collection? And I think that's a great question, because especially when you're looking at Duncan Fife furniture, pieces that may have been traditionally attributed to Fife, as scholarship increased on other New York cabinet makers, were sometimes reattributed. I'm trying to think. Well, actually, a good example, it's not a piece at Edgewater, but it's actually a piece at Airmount. There was a sofa that was attributed to Fife at the time that Mr. Jenrette purchased it, but more recent scholarship suggested that it was actually a piece by Lonnie Way. So, and that's what I think that's interesting about, you know, especially if you look at in the early 20th century, almost every piece of New York furniture was attributed to Duncan Fife. But then as more scholarship, as people starting back with, you know, Charles O. Cornelius in the 1920s, and then I'm completely Nancy McClellan, excuse me, in the 1940s, as these books that started looking at characteristics of Fife furniture, construction details, that sort of thing. And then as scholars started looking at other New York cabinet makers who were contemporary with Fife, they were discovering that, you know, not all these pieces that originally had been thought by Fife were actually Fife. And of course, the other challenge, as many collectors know, is in very rare instances did Fife actually label his pieces. So a lot of attribution is based on construction characteristics. And I should have mentioned that one of the things that we're so excited about the acquisition of that pair of window seats from the Donaldson Commission is the under upholstery of one seat does have Fife's signature on it. So it's our first signed Fife piece in the collection.
I should unmute before I ask you a question. I have a question, and then it looks like we have a hand raised in the audience. Can you tell us a little bit about the Stewart portraits that Dick and Bill acquired? Was that because they had a particular interest in Stewart? Because I gather that the sitters are not said to be Livingstons or Donaldsons.
Yeah, no, those I think just, of course, the interest started out with Van Ness. Of course, Van Ness was a local Columbia County native, and then, like I said, by coincidence, the other descendant happened to see the article, and so he was able to acquire the pair and bring the pair together. The other pair, the Wheelers, were an auction purchase in the 1990s, and again, they're a great pair of portraits, and I think that was probably their interest in them. It's a great pair of portraits. Again, it's from that later Stewart period, and yeah, I think that's probably was why their interest in those.
Let me get there. We have a question from David. Let me unmute you. Here, go ahead. If you're talking, we can't hear you. So maybe can you type your question in the chat box, and we'll try to answer it. Got another question from Isabel.
Who looks like they are okay.
Hi. I'm wondering if you know some of the background of how and why did Dick first start collecting?
What was the first part of the question, please?
How and when did Richard Jenrette first start collecting?
Sure. In the 1960s, he originally collected, as I alluded to early in my talk, Georgian British pieces and some continental European antiques. He talks about it was influenced by a roommate whose family had lent a number of pieces to furnish sort of their first one of the first apartments he lived in New York right out of school. One of the things I'll direct you to is the series of blog entries I wrote, the article on our website about the chronology of historic houses. I sort of, the second in that series talks about the interiors and some of the furnishing history and some of his collecting as well, and some of the other designers he worked with. So not to promote something I wrote, but just that's a good source that I would recommend looking at for that. But as I said, it was really the Empire Mafia and Fred, I'm Fred Johnston, who really was to convince him to start collecting American decorative arts. And again, that's obviously the strength of our collection. That's what he became known for as a collector. And yeah, so that's.
How often did the trains go by Edgewater?
The trains go by about twice an hour, and the one goes by, the one is right about a little before midnight. That's the one that's the interesting one. But of course, the great story that Mr. Jenrette recounted in his book, Adventures with Old Houses, is that Gore Vidal, because Gore Vidal obviously liked to hear himself talk in dinner parties, would hear the train coming and lean over to the person next to him and say, "Now tell me about yourself." And of course, the train would come by and completely drown them out. And I'm actually going to briefly share my screen again, Joe, because I had a suggested list of books and things that I forgot to promote. So while I'm doing that, I see a great question, and somebody asked if there are any reproductions in the house. There were briefly, because at one point in the 1980s, the Brooklyn Museum asked for the window seats back from that loan. So Mr. Jenrette had exact copies made of those. So those are the reproductions that are in the house. Let me, okay, get it.
I'm gonna take the decision.
I'm gonna share my screen again.
Try to get up.
And make sure, there we go. I'm going to briefly leave that up for anybody that wants to see that. Just again, these are for further reading. Of course, Mr. Jenrette's books, both Adventures with Old Houses and then More Adventures with Old Houses, which is specifically focused on Edgewater, and then just some other sources about some of these objects that I've discussed. So if you wanted a good thing to do, you can screenshot that really quickly. I'm going to now stop sharing again and come back here. Oh, I see another good question, Joe. I'm just going to jump in if you don't mind. It said, which item is my favorite? That's a really hard question. I could spend about 6 hours talking about my favorite objects in our collection. And I should say that that's what attracted me to join Classical American Homes, to join the staff in the summer of 2020, was this amazing collection that Mr. Jenrette and Bill Thompson assembled, as well as these amazing houses. And I don't know, I think all the objects are interesting, and it's not just because they're significant examples of American decorative arts, but it's the stories behind them. It's the provenance. It's how these objects passed from, one member of a family to another one, or the coincidences that, or not coincidences, that allowed some of these objects to come back to Edgewater, especially the Donaldson pieces, after being away from the property for almost 100 years. And yeah, it's neat. And what's really cool, one of the other things, I didn't have an opportunity to talk about it much, but I had a slide of it, of that 1822 invoice that we recently acquired as well. And that had a number of pieces on it that we already had in the collection. That sofa that from the Donaldson suite that Dick found at auction in 1980, the pair of card tables, that center table that's obviously not in our collection, but in Winter's collection. And again, it's just the Fife furniture is a phenomenal suite of furniture. And Donaldson himself is really interesting too. He's of course only one player in the history of Edgewater, but basically, as I mentioned, the Donaldson siblings are orphaned. He comes into an inheritance through an uncle in London, but he's really interesting. And the book that I recommend if you want to learn a little more about Donaldson is Gene Bradley Anderson's Carolinian on the Hudson, which looks at his experiences in North Carolina. And what's interesting about that, Dick didn't know until several years after he owned Edgewater that, he was the second North Carolinian. Oh, thank you very much, Joe. But that Dick was the second North Carolinian and alumnus of UNC Chapel Hill to own Edgewater. Of course, the first being Robert Donaldson. But yeah, I realize I still haven't mentioned my favorite object in the house, but I don't know. I think the portrait of Susan Gaston Donaldson is phenomenal just because of the objects that are depicted in it. The fact that we know it hung at Blythewood, it hung here at Edgewater, and actually we had it. We took the backing board off of it recently to just photograph the back, and the original brass hanging rings are still on it, which gives an indication of how the Donaldsons would have hung the painting as well. So I'm just going to scroll through the chat here and see. Somebody asked if any of the Lanniway pieces in the collection are labeled. I don't believe. Now, I confess I haven't crawled under that large armoire French press to see if there's a label anywhere on it. And I apologize for the quality of that photo. It's actually in a very small space, so you have to stand in the next room outside and try to shoot it through the door. But that's on my list of things to do next time I'm at Edgewater. And when I have the chance, when I have the opportunity, I'm always, sliding marble tops over just a little, because the place you tend to see labels, or the other thing I should say about Lanniway is, in addition to labeling, again, he's a French trained cabinet maker. So he's actually stamping a lot of his pieces in the same way that French cabinet makers did. And a great place to look for that stamp is sometimes on the top of the wood. So sliding the marble top over. And so that's one of the things that I always like to do. I should have put a picture of one of the times I was at Edgewater. One of my colleagues took a picture of me with a flashlight with my head under a table. That's kind of where I am. When I'm not giving a tour or doing something, I'm always investigating the furniture and the objects when I'm there.
Isabel, do you want to go ahead?
Is there any relationship between the Donaldsons and the Donaldson of Donaldson, Jenrette?
There is not. That was a question that Mr. Jenrette said that he got a lot, but he discusses it in Adventures with Old Houses, and said that he even did some genealogical research, but could not find a connection. And Joe, some people are saying chat has been disabled. That was a few minutes ago, but so it may have been.
I'll try to sort that out. Chat should work. Sorry. You can try to send a message directly to me or Grant. It seems like Grant is getting messages.
I see another good, somebody asked, in addition to the Morse painting, are there other objects in the Edgewater collection that we're looking for? Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a couple of other known Donaldson pieces that I believe are still out there floating around. And yeah, there's one there, and I should say there's another, yeah, the next time I give a talk, I'll hopefully be able to allude to some other forthcoming acquisitions. But that's one of the things I should say, that we're definitely continuing to acquire, to add to the collections based on criteria that we have, and in our collections management policy. And it was, especially great to be able to bring those pieces that had been on loan from the Brooklyn Museum for, many decades into the permanent collection, because those are pieces that Mr. Jenrette had always wanted to join the collection. So it's great to be able to bring those back to Edgewater to stay.
So chat is fixed.
I'm scrolling through the questions here. Oh, great. Somebody asked, how does somebody visit Edgewater without a car from Manhattan? I can tell you that it's an easy train trip up. You can the Amtrak train goes up to Rhinecliff, and then there's transportation options to get there. It's about a 10-minute drive from the Rhinecliff station. You can also, it's a slightly longer drive from Poughkeepsie, but is it the Hudson River line that goes up to Poughkeepsie? Hope somebody from New York, please correct me if I'm saying incorrect things, but yeah, you can easily get up there by train. And it's about, if you wanted to drive, it's about a 2-hour drive. I guess it's 100 miles straight up the river. Interesting thing about the river, this has nothing to do with modern transportation, but one of the businesses that Robert Donaldson owned up there was a steamboat that did basically transportation between New York City and the region around Edgewater. Because of course, at the time period, river was one of the quickest, by water was one of the quickest ways to travel. Somebody asked if I'll be showing the bedrooms at Edgewater in a future presentation. Yes, and the bedrooms on the second floor are fully furnished. We just do not take tours up there because they're smaller spaces and it's difficult to accommodate the tour size in those parts of the house. Oh, somebody asked if the closed armchairs in the dining room were originally open. That I don't know. I should say it would be interesting though in the future to have some investigative upholstery analysis done on them to see. That's what's great about furniture, is all the clues that it leaves behind.
Grant, there's a question here. What role did Mr. Thompson play in Dick's acquisition?
Sure. Dick was very much, Bill was very much involved in the acquisitions and the furnishings. Bill was also a designer and actually designed a number of the window treatments and bed hangings for some of the later houses as well. So again, a very active role in the acquisition of the collection, and a very active role in Classical American Homes, serving on the board of the organization until his passing as well. I see somebody asked, when they lived there, was there casual furniture for daily use? Yes, there are a number of comfy stuffed club chairs and sofas and things throughout the house. But again, as I said, they also encourage people to sit in the Fife chairs, the other chairs in the collection. It was definitely a collection that was used. Well, thank you again, everyone, for attending. It was a pleasure to present the lecture, and we're already talking about doing a similar lecture on the collection, focusing on some of our other properties as well. So, and again, I hope you will, take the time and come up to visit Edgewater. It's an amazing house. It's only 100 miles north of the city, but it feels like you're 1,000 miles away. And I really didn't go into the history of Edgewater in this talk, but again, Lowndes Brown, the first owner, was actually a South Carolina native. And that's why there's some thought that Robert Mills may have consulted or played a role in the design of the house, because it certainly looks more like a South Carolina plantation house than it does your typical Hudson Valley regional architecture. So again, it's an amazing house and amazing collection as well.
Well, thanks again, everybody. Take a look at our website on our events page and check out our Instagram and Facebook pages where we make announcements about upcoming events like this. And we will announce an upcoming AJ Davis Architectural History Tour that's coming up in June. So we've got some exciting things coming up. Stay tuned. And if you know somebody who would be interested in these things, please do share it with them. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.